to meet you.
So what, I don't get a hello? That's how I get treated?
I
Wow.
already complimented your beard.
Wow.
You're okay. I hello, Craig,
You know,
my
I'm very needy.
good friend from long time. How you do?
I'm good. I'm good. Uh, okay. Try again, Shauna.
Okay, hello.
Okay,
Oh,
okay,
hello.
wonderful.
Hi there.
Okay, so it's 6:01. We're gonna wait a few minutes.
Yeah, we're just gonna wait another minute for
Okay.
more folks to get online, and then we will start.
Okay.
All right. Tell me if this is good enough light. I'm gonna put on some more. You tell me if it's too much.
All right.
Is that too much?
No, that's good.
This is good. This is
Yeah,
better.
Yeah, is that good for you?
It's fine for me. I just don't know how it looks.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
fine. That's
Yeah,
Okay,
fine,
good,
Anna.
good.
That looks good.
that's good.
Okay,
You're
good, good.
looking
Thanks.
fabulous as usual.
Thank you,
I
thank
tell
you,
you,
thank you,
I
thank you.
tell you.
Flattery will get you everywhere.
All righty.
Hello, Dr. Davis. So good to see you. So good to see you.
All right. All righty. So let us, I think we should begin. Start on
All right.
time. You know,
Okay.
not going to do the Caribbean thing, right? All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our discussion, Love, Lust, and Literature. This roundtable discussion is a part of the annual Blue Flamingo Literary Festival hosted by the University of the Bahamas and School of English. So, bit of background, last year in 2020, our main festival, which was scheduled for March of 2020, was canceled due to the national lockdown resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the fall semester, the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival Committee decided to move forward using the available online modalities to continue, and a series of panel discussions scheduled for the fall included a panel on Bahamian folklore as inspiration for contemporary cultural productions, Black in comics and the significance of the Black Panther film, which was a roundtable discussion focused on representation of Black lives in comics. And the last one last year was an evening of poetry, Voices Across the Diaspora, where we invited poets from across the diaspora to share with us. Now in its fifth year, the aim of the festival is to promote reading, writing, and literary arts within the Bahamas by reaching out to local, regional, and international partners. The Blue Flamingo Literary Festival hopes to create a space for developing, highlighting, and encouraging thriving Bahamian literary culture. The Blue Flamingo Literary Festival includes poetry readings, book launches, panel discussions, writing workshops, live stage music, and spoken word performances. Writing and poetry contests, as well as activities specifically targeted towards the youth. On March 18th and 19th of this year, which is next month, we will launch our virtual Blue Flamingo Literary Festival with a full slate of events over 2 days. And these events include poetry workshops, graphic design workshop, writing comic books workshops, and a lot of other events. And so we hope to get that information out to everyone very soon. Before we move on, I would like to recognize the committee members of the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival for all of their work in organizing these events. They are my co-hosts this evening, Dr. Marie Searsing, Dr. Dustin Helberg, Dr. Saskia First, Bridget Stewart, Ivy Higgins, Maylin Seymour, and Princess Pratt, among other partners that we've also worked with as well. I would also like to thank the Chair of School of English, Dr. Mayuri Dika, and the Dean of Faculty of Liberal and Fine Arts, Dr. Douglas Barkey, for their continued support of the Blue Flamingo Literary Initiative. I also want to thank our 4 panelists for agreeing to take part in this evening's roundtable, Dr. Michael Buckner, Dr. Donna Azaware-Soleil, Dr. Shauna Morgan, and Dr. Peter Bailey. So thank you all for agreeing when I begged you to take part in this conversation. Now, before we introduce our panelist, I want to just talk a little bit about housekeeping, how this is going to work. I have muted everyone. As questions come up, I would ask you to write your questions in the chat, and myself and Dr. Seer Singh, once the panelists have presented, will ask your questions for you. And so to introduce our speakers, I would like to introduce my co-host for the evening, A. Marie Seer Singh. Dr. Seer Singh is Associate Professor in English Studies at the University of the Bahamas, where she teaches a range of composition and literature courses, including writing and rhetoric, advanced composition, Bahamian literature, American literature, Caribbean women's writers, West Indian literature, and contemporary African literatures. Dr. Seer Singh is advisory editor for the College Language Association Journal in the area of Caribbean and African diaspora literatures. She serves on the editorial board of the International Journal of Bahamian Studies, a publication of the University of the Bahamas, as well as on the editorial board of Tout Monde, Caribbean Journal of Cultural Studies. Her research interests include literatures of the African diaspora with an emphasis on women writers, the intersection of literature and African philosophy, Caribbean literary and cultural theory, and gender and cultural studies. Dr. Seer Singh.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just so very excited. Looking forward to this event, very much so. And we have 4 dynamic panelists who I'm about to introduce to get this event underway. I begin with Dr. Donna Azaware-Soli, who is Vice President of the Association of Caribbean Women Writers and Scholars and former coordinator of the Mellon Foundation's Hispanic Serving Institutions Pathway to the Professoriate Fellowship at Florida International University. She's also an Associate Professor of English and affiliate faculty in African and African Diaspora Studies, Center for Women and Gender Studies, and LACC at FIU. And Andrew W. Mellon and Citizens and Scholars Fellow, formerly Woodrow Wilson Fellow, Soli is the author of Eroticism, Spirituality, and Resistance in Black Women's Writing, published by University of Florida Press in 2015. 2 poetry collections, First Rain, People Tree Press, 2006, and The Woman Who Knew, Finishing Line Press, 2016. She's also co-editor of Caribbean Erotic, published by People Tree Press in 2010 and co-edited with Opal Palmer Adisa. This latter publication features essays, fiction, and poetry from 62 writers from the English-speaking, Spanish-speaking, and French-speaking Caribbean. Her critical and creative writings have been widely published in national and international forums, including scholarly and literary journals and edited volumes. Our second presenter will be Dr. Shauna M. Morgan, who is the author of Fear of Dogs and Other Animals, published by Central Square Press. She's a poet and scholar from rural community in Clarendon, Jamaica. An associate professor of creative writing and Africana literature at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She has published poetry in A Gathering Together, Proud Flesh, New African Journal of Culture, Politics and Consciousness, Pluck, the Journal of Afro-Lation Art and Culture, Interviewing the Caribbean, as well as other journals. Her critical work has appeared in the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, South Atlantic Review, Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, and Ariel, which is a review of international English literature, among other periodicals. Shauna recently moved to Lexington, Kentucky, where she tends to a hopeful garden. I'm sure it's flourishing. Our third presenter, Dr. Michael Buckner, is an associate professor, former head of the Department of Literatures and English, and the public orator of the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. He's a first-class honors UWI graduate in English who completed his MA and PhD degrees at the University of Western Ontario on a Commonwealth scholarship. In 1999, he received the USIS Fellowship to the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and in 2002, the Du Bois Mandela Rodney Postdoctoral Fellowship to the University of Michigan. He's also a recipient of the Institute of Jamaica's Gold Musgrave Medal for Eminence in the Field of Literature, an award he received in 2019. He's also a Farquharson Institute of Public Affairs Award recipient for Outstanding Promotion of Caribbean Literature, that in 2018. He also received in 2018 the Principals Award, Research Award for Best Research Publication article, and most recently in 2020, the Principals Research Award for the book chapter Horizons of Desire in Caribbean Queer Speculative Fiction, Marlon James's John Crow's Devil. He was chair of the Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies from 2010 to 2013. He currently serves on the editorial boards of Caribbean Quarterly, Issues in Critical Investigation, and Lucayos, and is senior editor of the Journal of West Indian Literature. He's also co-editor with Alison Donnell of the work, The Routledge Companion to Anglophone Caribbean Literature, and carries out research on Austin Clarke, Caribbean Canadian writing, post-colonial literatures and theory, diaspora studies, masculinities, and popular culture. Most importantly, he is currently teaching a course on erotic poetry this semester at UWI Mona campus. Our final panelist, Dr. Peter Bailey, is assistant professor in the School of English Studies at the University of the Bahamas. His research mainly focuses on the literature of decadence and aestheticism. He works at the intersection of gender and sexuality studies and Victorian studies. He's currently working on a book manuscript entitled Aestheticism and the Erotics of Pedagogy, and Essays on Decadence and Caribbean Texts. Please join me in welcoming warmly our 4 panelists for this evening's roundtable event. I think you present in that order. So we begin with Dr. Wersoli.
All righty then. Okay, so I want to start with talking a little bit about 2 writers, one of whom I have been threatening to become familiar with for a long time, and one I've been familiar with for more than half my life, actually, a lot more than half my life. So it's Audre Lorde and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I finally read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Love in the Time of Cholera, because I thought, how apt, right? Right now, in the time of COVID, let me see what this book that I have heard so much about is all about. Really liked it, but I immediately started to compare how he deals with, how he analogizes illness and romantic love, or illness and passion, especially unrequited love, and comparing it to how Lorde deals with it. So, for example, in Lorde's poem, Sisters in Arms, it's a poem about the poet, I suppose, a poetic persona, and a South African freedom fighter. So two warrior women making love. And for them, making love is both a way to connect across difference and a way to connect different struggles. Love making becomes a temporary armistice, if you will, both a laying down of arms and a laying on of hands, right, so to speak. Kind of like in the Marvin Gaye context of sexual healing is how I read that to some extent, right? And it makes me wonder if there is something, there's a deeper connection there between sex and healing that cannot happen in porn or in casual sex that is disconnected, reductive, or objectifying. And I do believe that is so. And part of the reason I'm convinced this is so is because she also talks about self-pleasure in the cancer journals, and she talks about self-pleasure as a way of dealing with the mastectomy, a way of healing from the mastectomy, a way of getting in touch with how she really feels about all that is happening with her body and the illness, the cancer, and so on happening in her body. She uses her own self-pleasuring to talk about, to kind of get to the other side of the trauma, but also to work through the trauma and to understand the trauma. And I thought that that was fascinating. And then comparing that to Sisters in Arms, when she, I'm just going to read one stanza from Sister in Arms. The edge of our bed was a wide grid where your 15-year-old daughter was hanging gut sprung on police wheels, a cablegram nailed on the wood next to a map of the Western Reserve. I could not return with you to bury the body, reconstruct your nightly cardboards against the seeping Transvaal cold. I could not plant the other limpet mine against a wall at the railroad station, nor carry either of your souls back from the river in a calabash upon my head. So I bought you a ticket to Durban on my American Express, and we lay together in the first light of a new season, right? And in Marquez's work, the way that he analogizes romantic love with illness, because it's in the time of cholera. So there's a way in which he talks about romantic love as kind of like a slow burning fever, particularly this unrequited love that he's carried around for almost 51 years for this woman. It's like a slow burning fever that consumes your body and your soul, right? It's sexual passion, but sexual passion without that romantic love, because I think he has like 622 affairs over a 50-year period waiting for this woman, right?
Wow.
Who eventually, her husband, well, I hope I'm not giving it away for anybody. Maybe everybody else has read it except for me. but eventually he gets her, but 51 years, right? He's holding back his love. So he has 62 love affairs, but he won't allow any of them to touch him deeply. And one or two of them come close to touching him, but he kind of pushes it away because he's just determined that he's going to get her. And so for those for those love affairs where he's not giving his whole soul and heart, just his body, the sexual love, passion without love is either frenetic, furtive, and mysterious, like the sudden onset of a disease, or it's languorous and decadent without being nourishing to the soul, kind of like a sweet dessert full of calories, but no nutritious substance. And I thought that was so interesting, the difference between how he talks about passion and sexual pleasure, and the way Lord talks about passion and sexual pleasure. She also talks about in the Cancer Journals how the love of woman saved her. And I was really struck by that as well. Like, so he has the 622 women and he gets a lot from them, but he doesn't give anything in return. And this is what she says. I do not know why. I do know that there was a tremendous amount of love and support flowing into me from the women around me. And it felt like being bathed in a continuous flow, tide of positive energies, even when sometimes I wanted a bit of negative silence to complement the pain inside of me. But support will always have a special and vividly erotic set of images, meanings for me now, one of which is floating upon a sea within a ring of women, like warm bubbles keeping me afloat upon the surface of that sea. I can feel the texture of inviting water just beneath their eyes and do not fear it. It is the sweet smell of their breath and laughter and voices calling my name that gives me volition, helps me remember I want to turn away from looking down. These images flow quickly, the tangible flood of energy rolling off these women toward me that I converted into power to heal myself. And there's nothing furtive and hidden about these this relationship she has with these women. She's talking about her lover, Francis, as well as the women in her community who are her support system. But for Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 622 women, none of them know each other. None of them have ever met. As a matter of fact, the woman he's in love with, Fermina, that Diza, I think, Fermina Diza, she doesn't know. The rumor she hears about him is that he's gay. And that's what he allows everybody to think. So that he has these 622 affairs, but nobody in the community has ever linked his name with a woman for 51 years because he goes to them furtively. He either brings them on the boat on the weekend when no one else is around, or he kind of treats them like prostitutes, or he goes to them at night. And in one case, he's with one woman who he ends up claiming her body, physically claiming her. And do I have time to read just one thing from her? Yeah, okay, good. Let me find it because I don't have it. I have the book here on my phone. So let me find that section, because that one I thought was really interesting. What tends to happen to the woman? It's like they tend to die for him, right? And I thought that was really interesting. So give me just a second to open it up. Okay. So this woman is a married woman with whom he's having an affair. And I love Garcia Marquez's writing, but I remember reading this and thinking that doesn't sound right because of what happened. And so I'd love your opinion on that when you get a chance to ask questions, because I thought it was very odd, the set of circumstances that he sets up, how this woman what eventually happens to this woman who falls in love with him and still has to go home to her husband. So let me see if I can find it. All right, 222, I think it is. I can't find it and I don't want to hold you up. But anyway, he scrawls on her body. He scrawls on the woman's pubis. This, you know what is mine. Right? This is my pee, right? And she goes home to her husband and forgets that he is. Now, you know, there ain't no woman gonna forget that scroll. He does it in paint, red paint. Ain't no woman gonna forget that scroll. We ain't gonna forget that's there. Okay, that ain't happening. So I was like, okay, okay, Garcia Marquez. I'm not quite believing this part. I'm with you all the way, but right here, no. And so anyway, the husband just doesn't say anything. He just gets up and kills her, just stabs her to death. And that's just one example. Is another girl in that he seduces, basically a 14-year-old girl who's put into his care, a family member. He seduces her, and she ends up when eventually the lover that he wants, when the lover's husband dies and he's able to get this woman, he just abandons this girl like in the flip of a switch. He finds out that the woman is a widow and he abandons this 14-year-old girl. And in the end, she ends up killing herself over him. So it's like there's a series of stuff like that. But there are other relationships with women that don't end that way. But the fact that it's like it's furtive, it's all hidden. He gets a lot from them. He can go to them any time of the night, but they don't really, a good portion of them want more from him and they're never able to get it because he's just not giving himself. But the relationship that he has with the woman that he's in love with, it's really not a relationship. It's a phantom relationship because they're not even on speaking terms for 51 years. So I thought it was interesting to compare these two writers and the different ways in which they handle, illness and love. Because when he's in love, he becomes feverish as if he has cholera as well. And of course, the entire book is built around the idea of cholera and also the war, right, in Colombia as well. So it's really fascinating, the comparisons between the two of them. That's as far as I was able to get with it, something I would like to continue, but Craig making me do this kind of forced me to think about those two because I was reading Garcia Marquez at the time when I was asked to do this. So I found it an interesting comparison, quite unexpected. I wasn't planning on it.
Thank you so very much, Donna. Some food for thought. I'm sure we'll be getting questions in that direction when we get to that point in the program. And so I invite now Dr. Morgan, Shauna Morgan, to give your presentation.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. And I just want to thank Dr. Sear Singh and Dr. Smith for inviting me. It's always good to be connected to this festival in some way. So I'm going to just share some thoughts, and then hopefully, if you will permit me, I would just share a few poems as well. All right. Really glad to be talking about, to be sort of launching from Audre Lorde, her work has been so important to me personally and professionally. And so I'll start with her. The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings, wrote Audre Lorde in Uses of the Erotic. I'm somewhat preoccupied with how that measure, that dimension that she references, is shaped by physical spaces we occupy, and more specifically, how the natural world is, the natural world, also imbued with its own erotic, right, becomes a place in which our erotic power can be awakened and ultimately open up a path to liberation. Particularly interesting to me are the literary engagements with the natural world in which our erotic selves meet the sensuality of the landscape or environment to help us, in a way, articulate those strong feelings to which Lorde refers, right? The strongest feelings, she says. An example from her own creative work can be heard, felt, and seen in her poem, On a Night of the Full Moon. And I'll read it here. And this is one of my favorite Lorde poems. On a night of the full moon, out of my flesh that hungers and my mouth that knows comes the shape I am seeking for reason. The curve of your waiting body fits my waiting hand, your breasts warm as sunlight, your lips quick as your birds, between your thighs the sweet, sharp taste of limes. Thus, I hold you frank in my heart's eye, in my skin's knowing, as my fingers conceive your flesh, I feel your stomach moving against me. Before the moon wanes again, we shall come together. And I would be the moon spoken over your beckoning flesh, breaking against reservations, breaching thought, my hands at your high tide, over and under, inside you, and the passing of hunger attended, forgotten. Darkly risen, the moon speaks, my eyes judging your roundness delightful. I hope I've done it some justice. The poem immerses us in sensation, of course, but it's not contradictory to Lorde's critique of what she refers to as the superficially erotic, right? Or that idea of, quote, she says, sensation without feeling. Rather, the poem is itself an illustration of Lorde's point that the erotic, as she says, quote, is not a question only of what we do. It is a question of how acutely and fully we can feel in this doing. So in this poem, we're both pulled in by the poem's portrayal of erotic in the physical sense, right? A deep sensation in breasts warm as sunlight. And we also experience the feeling, right? That line, the skin's knowing. And in that essay, right, that sort of anchors us today, she talks about this other kind of knowing, this erotic knowing. So the skin's knowing that brings us to a sensation and the passing of hunger, attended, forgotten. And those lines just that in particular stick with me, right? Because we see this moment where a hunger is satiated, but it also signals the possibility of a world of longing to be fulfilled in some way, right? Another world of longing. And in my own work, I'm interested in longing and desires and the way that the erotic of which Lorde speaks can allow us to claim a sense of belonging, right? Maybe in a place where we're foreign, for example, that's my preoccupation. Or even to claim freedoms to sort of dream against what she describes as, quote, the principal horror of a system which defines the good in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need, or which defines human need to the exclusion of the psychic and emotional components of that need. So there is something that she says robs our work of its erotic value. She says of its erotic power and life appeal and fulfillment. And so I'm going to read a few poems that attempt to claim the erotic in self and in the natural world, moving that measure, right? At least attempting to move that measure of self and feeling, love and freedoms. And I'm really in this work trying to work out again those ideas of belonging, right? How can you call on the power of the erotic, right? That thing that's the inward thing that she refers to, right? To mitigate the circumstances, to transform the circumstances in which you live, to transform those horrors, right, of the reality of our existence in this world. And so the act, for me, the act of writing itself, right, not just a sort of formulation of metaphors, but even the very act of writing, I think is a way of entering that, right, inward space where you call up the erotic. So I'm going to try to be mindful of the time and just share a few poems of mine here. This first poem comes from a series of poems called the Valley Poems, and they deal with sort of being a foreigner in a space and trying to connect, trying to find home and be at home. And the thing that seems to be the catalyst for the connection is that space, again, the measure between self and that deep feeling. This valley away. When this valley feels so far away from what I know, you pull me up, saying, come here, sweet woman. You take me up to that cold black hill, make me walk on that old dirt road and kick up dust on my legs. You let me sip your granddaddy's batch until dark comes and fireflies blink in familiar rhythm. You show me stars I gazed at as a girl, lay me down on the wood porch, make me feel its dents and crevices against my back. When I feel so far away from this valley, you pull me up, kiss the sweat at my hairline, and let me see just what it is I know. I'll share. One of the things that I'm attempting to do, I'm sort of obsessed with birds right now, and looking at them, listening to them. And I'm also particularly interested in those birds that live, those migratory birds that move from North America to the Caribbean, ones you can find in both places and how they make a life. This is a poem for the black-throated blue warbler called Black-Throated Songs. The understory trembles, confessing the secret of her nest in woodbine, virgin ivy. She listens, flits her unremarkable self, offers up a moment. See, see. Shrill to a buzz, she perches higher, bill up. See, see. A melody skyward, cotton belly, black throat quivering, eminent plume turning blue as the mist burns away. See, see, see. She vibrates her wings. Everything else falls away. Under a deciduous canopy, hovering together in after songs until the young are fledged, until the freedom of salt air, until the sanctuary of moist ginger lily, until the oak and maple come again. There, a white spot on a wing below the viburnum berries bursting, a faithful warble of fruit. And I'll close with one poem, Rekindling, It's called Rekindling from my chapbook. It's a poem in 4 parts. And I hope this is one of those poems that I hope sort of exemplifies this space where the erotic appears, right? Not in that superficial way, but in a way that the feeling is deep and connects to the natural world. Rekindling. 1. He found me, not quite asleep in the hollow of a thicket on a bed of lightwood, and I, no longer green, would have burst into flames at the sight of him, at the sound of his voice, if not for the river and the moon and the steady hand of the universe. 2. When I stood and stepped out holding his scarred arm, I felt the acute sensation of his touch move me to intoxication, a fervid vertigo, spinning me into the sunset and into the darkness that followed. 3. It was here he set me ablaze with word and touch and gifts unexplained by time. And when he heaped onto me all the weight of oak and a fire as ancient as the sun, I ignited, became new. 4. I imagine him now, having left me seared in my newness, kindling old fires sacred as the wind, moving slowly to remember precisely how he yearned to a flash, how he rendered a life into embers, beautiful and warm, the remains of something familiar. And for me, much of the feeling that's imbued in this poem, I think, again, creates a sense of belonging. Yeah, this poem was for my husband. Thank you all.
Marie, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morgan, for those wonderful reflections and for sharing your work with us. And we look forward to questions from the audience following all 4 presenters. So now I call on Dr. Peter Bailey to make his presentation. And following that, we will have Dr. Michael Buckner, and that will conclude the presentations.
All right. So one of the things I've been thinking about since the European conquest of the Caribbean islands to the present, the region has been constructed as a pornographic playground, a space of libertinage where sensual and sexual pleasures could be sought out amid a relaxed moral and religious discipline. Sun, sand, and sea, and sex still sell. And yet, if the inhabitants of the islands are all too familiar with the pervasiveness of sex, doesn't mean that they're comfortable with it, that they own it, that they represent their erotic desires and identities and discourse with a great degree of comfort. I'm reminded of Roland Barthes' introduction to his deconstruction of amorousness, a lover's discourse, in which he says, the lover's discourse is today of an extreme solitude. This discourse is spoken perhaps by thousands of subjects, who knows, but warranted by no one. It's completely forsaken by the surrounding languages, ignored, disparaged, derided by them, severed not only from authority, but also from the mechanisms of authority, sciences, techniques, arts. Once a discourse is thus driven by its own momentum into the backwater of the unreal, it has no recourse but to become the site, however exiguous, of affirmation. And so we could see Barthes there thinking about the fact that we don't, or at least when he was writing, we probably still don't have any really good language to talk about love. You experience it, but it's not an official thing that you can write about with any particular authority. You feel it, but there's this question of how well it can be described, how well it can be expressed, how officially it can be recognized. And there are all these subjects, these kind of people that have desires and feelings that are not able to articulate what those are necessarily or to be acknowledged directly. And so one of the things that Bart is trying to do in that text is to give a description to the various states of love, of desire, to anatomize them, break them down into various stages and describe, you know, in detail, various forms of passion. And I wonder if we don't have to do that in our own literature. And I'm speaking specifically of the Bahamas right now. I'm thinking about if you had to make a map, if you had to describe all the various varieties of Bahamian love, what would that look like, right? What can't you talk about, all right? Like, we all know that you go to these funerals and there's a woman that's off to the corner and she's not quite in the church and she's mourning, or at the cemetery and she's not acknowledged, or maybe she is acknowledged. There's these other families. What is that story like, for instance? What is the great poem of the sweetheart? Or what's the great novel of the sweetheart? What is the great account of, you know, the inner city junglist and her love with the man that's out in life with Key? What does that look like, right? What is the great account of kind of interracial love in the Bahamas? Who are all these exiled kinds of subjects that you would need to provide uh, the fullest account of what erotic citizenship looks like in this country, right? What would be the cast of characters? What would be the narrative to describe the lovers' discourse of this country? And what would the literature look like if we had it? And what is the problem? Like, what prevents us from being able to represent those stories, right? What does the love of the queer Bahamian looks like? What are those accounts? And, you know, it seems to me that there's a great powerful myth that love is civically productive, right? That it's something that helps society in some way. If you go back to the Greeks, eros is this great thing that you have, and it helps you to you sublimate your love, right? You don't express it directly, but you channel it into building the law and you know, building a stable society. Or if you are a great romantic, you're able to turn your passion into an immortal work in which your beloved lives forever for everyone to read about and experience. But there's this question of what are the barriers to immortalizing these various forms of love in these ways? Okay, and where would our models come from? So just as an example for how important kind of building these traditions are, being able to look into the past and find examples of desire that you identify with, and then kind of writing them or rewriting them on your own terms. I was thinking of the poet Sappho, right, who talks so engagingly about what it is to be in love. And I'm just going to read one of her poems that talks about the experience of what it is to feel desire, and then read someone who is writing in response to her. Because it seems to me that this would be the kind of thing that we would have to do. Like, who are the Bahamian icons of the past, or who are the historical figures in the past that our current writers would need to write to and connect with? And Sappho wrote in her fragment 31, That man seems to me to be equal to the gods who is sitting opposite you and hears you nearby speaking sweetly and laughing delightfully, which indeed makes my heart flutter in my breast. For when I look at you, even for a short time, it is no longer possible for me to speak, but it is as if my tongue is broken, and immediately a subtle fire has run over my skin. I cannot see anything with my eyes, and my ears are buzzing. A cold sweat comes over me, trembling, seizes me all over. I am paler than grass, and I seem nearly to have died. And you can think about how familiar that sounds if you've been in love. Um, this is, hundreds and hundreds of years old, but recognizable. And Marilyn Hacker, writing back to Sappho, says, didn't Sappho say her guts clutched up like this before her face suddenly numinous, her eyes watered, knees melted? Did she lactate again, milk brought down by a girl's kiss? Its documented torrents are unloosed by such events as recently produced, not the wish, but the need to consume in us 1 pint of Malox, 1 of kaopectate. My eyes and groin are permanently swollen. I am alternatingly brilliant and witless and sleepless. Bed is just a swamp to roll in. Although I'd cream my jeans touching your breast, sweetheart, it isn't lust. It's all the rest of what I want with you that shares me shitless. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. And finally, Dr. Buckner will give his presentation, and then we'll open for Q&A. Dr. Buckner.
Thank you for your kind invitation to participate in this webinar and for your equally kind introduction. I should hasten to say, I'm not here because I have some oversized reputation as an expert on Shaggy's bombastic lover man who happens to teach literature, but because of recent teaching events. In my department at UWI, we have a course called Love, Death, and Poetry, and we have wanted to update this course under the rubric of erotic poetry. And so when I was assigned to teach this course this semester, I decided to experiment. I hope to share some of my thoughts on love, lust, and literature, although in spite of the alliterative luster of the title, I perhaps would recast the word lust as desire, and perhaps to focus my remarks on erotic desire, the politics of intimacy. While I'm looking at Thomas Hardy, a 19th century male poet in this course, I'm also looking at Tanya Shirley's work that is very frank about sexual desire, but it is also daring to challenge gender norms. And then I do have an anthology of poems from around the world. This made me start to think about Black erotica in literature. Several thinkers have already noted the way in which the imperialist project not only viewed the lives and cultures of Black people through a racist lens, but also through a patriarchal erotic frame. And I put those two words together. For example, in Imperial Leather, Anne McClintock makes the point that, quote, the narrative of New World imperialism was eroticized by rhetoric that sexualized imperialist practices of European colonizers. For example, in his travelogues, Columbus suggested that the earth is shaped like a woman's breast. Generally, she continues, this patriarchal narrative of imperialism depicts the New World through rhetoric normally ascribed to women, suggesting the land's passive and submissive nature awaiting the conquest of men. John Donne, writing between 1593 and 1596, in the middle of the European expansion into the New World, writes these lines to his mistress going to bed. Memorable lines. License my roving hands and let them go before, behind, between, above, below. Oh, my America, my newfound land, my kingdom, safest when with one man manned. my mine of precious stone, my empiry. How blessed am I in this discovery indeed. To enter in these bonds is to be free. Then where my hand is set, my seal shall be. Here he imagines the conquest of the woman's body as claiming land and its rich resources. To what extent then is writing the erotic for Black women involve an interrogation of these kinds of representation of the Black female body? In Grace Nichols's poem, Allah, for example, the erotic Black body becomes a site of resistance. As Dion Brand writes in her tribute poem to Phyllis Cord, quote, "You should have known the first thing they would jump on was the skill of your womb," unquote. This claim in the reproductive and sexual functions of Black women during colonization was central to the capitalist and patriarchal enterprise of slavery. Hilary Beckles, arguing in Centering Woman, the political economy of gender in West African and Caribbean society, says that, quote, "slavery was a system of socio-sexual exploitation and control of women." Yet Nichols's enslaved woman resists this by taking the life of her child, and she's mercilessly punished. In the poem, Nichols foregrounds the erotic body of the enslaved female that the plantation owner puts on display. She's naked as she receives her punishment. This strategy of foregrounding that recognizes both the role of female sexuality in slavery, but also to show how women resist. Face up, they hold her naked body to the ground, arms and legs spread eagle, each tied with rope to stake. Then they coat her in sweet molasses and call us out to see the rebel woman who with a pin stick the soft mold of her own child's head, sending the little newborn soul winging its way back to Africa free. Yet, beyond the exploitation of women's sexual labor for capitalist gain, because of the conception of their bodies as always available for sexual conquest, was the further racist idea that the Black subject, both men and women, were oversexed. According to Aneka Marshall in her essay From Sexual Denigration to Self-Respect, she says, during slavery, the belief that Africans were subhuman savages with uncontrollable sexual capacities was used to legitimate the exploitation of their labor. How does the Caribbean writer penning erotica escape this focus on the sexuality of the Black subject without subscribing to this mythology? Is one of the challenges I see. Bell Hooks, for example, explained that Black men's preoccupation with the phallus is part of the history, is part of that history. Bell Hooks in the essay, It's a Dick Thing, indicates that, quote, the convergence of racist, sexist thinking about the Black body, which has always projected onto the Black body a hypersexuality. And in Jamaica, the obsession with dick size is represented in crotch holding, in tall tales of sexual conquest. It is immortalized in the wood carvings in Fern Gully. It is celebrated in the sun sea sex tourism of the North Coast, as represented by Peter, as Peter said earlier. It is reflected in the debates over the emancipation statue, and it is reinforced in the dancehall songs that promote this obsession. Poets such as Tanya Shirley confronts this reproduction in her focus on what I call phallic eroticism in a poem like Negotiation. It begins with an epigraph coined much like a Caribbean proverb. Epigraph, big dick can't go to supermarket. Yes, I know I am beautiful, my mother tells me so frequently. Yes, I know the way I move my waist is magic. I'm from the Caribbean. Yes, it does excite me that you promised to perform cunnilingus. I hear I'm sweet like mango. But what else do you bring to this table? And she goes through a series of things. I want to read a couple of the verses. Do you have a baby you're yet to claim because you're waiting to see if he looks like you? If I start crying at the sight of a full moon, a starving child, a dead rose, a lizard over my front door, will you appease me without condescension? And don't you forget, don't you think I forgot? Do you have a big dick? My third kind of inquiry is to what extent erotic pleasure is part of the Black subject reclaiming their humanity. Kegurio, Acharyo, and others have suggested that even from the degradation of the slave ship and slave plantation, touch and the whole affective world of erotic pleasure was one of the sites for Black people to express their humanity. If, as Césaire claimed, thingification during slavery was a strategy of imperialist control, to which Rex Nettleford offered smallification as the need or the desire for Blacks in Jamaica to reclaim their humanity. One of the ways of expressing one's humanity is through erotic pleasure. Grace Nichols represents this very well in the poem, I Go to Meet Him, where on this plantation, these are the thoughts of this female subject. Mornings of dew and promises, the sound of birds singing, pink and red hibiscus kissing. I must devote some time to the joy of living. Raising up from my weeding of ripening cane, my eyes make four with this man. There ain't no reason to laugh, but I laughing in confusion. His hands soft, his words quick, his lips curling as in prayer. I nod. I like this man. Tonight I go to meet him like a flame. I see the trembling star of murder in your palm, Black man, bleeding and raging to death inside yourself, broken and twisted as a wheel, watching your blood run thin and saltless to the earth as you grip the throat of Cain, kin of my skin, you are. I have raised three aspects of the representation of the Black body. Black female body is available for conquest, the Black body in general as oversexed, but also the Black erotic body as a site for the reclamation of their humanity. Conrad James, quoting Jafari Allen's book on the erotics of Black self-making in Cuba, argues that the recuperation of the quotidian spaces and practices of personal agency as political and encourages us to pay attention to everyday gestures that must be read closely for their impulse towards personal freedom, which when thought through and redeployed, collectively instantiate moves towards liberation or a larger freedom. Here is a female persona in Shirley's poem, declaring what she imagines is an enjoyable sex relationship. And I end my presentation with this. Journey. Fruit. I want to be the mango that makes you long to be home. I open my legs for you. Yellow juice stains the white sheets. You chew slowly, then swallow, making a meal out of me. Tongue. These palms oiled for you, holy is each finger in your mouth. Let me dry your dripping words, feed you flesh until you're hoarse. Your tongue is a hummingbird pulling pollen out of me. Stir. My back against your broad chest, you swirl until I'm sore. I bend forward, hips stirring, we move dangerously slow. Sated, we stumble to bed, the sea spilling out of us.
Well, thank you so very much, all panelists. Yeah, fantastic reflections, fantastic theorizations, etc., on this whole business of the erotic, the power of the erotic, the uses of the erotic, how we theorize and apply the erotic, the discourse very broadly. And what I gather from each of the presenters, from something you've said, something you read from your own work or the work of somebody else, is the idea of reclaiming, getting back the power of the erotic, moving away from the pathologization of this aspect of identity, reclaiming, all right? So it's about the reclamation. I gather that from virtually what everybody says. Peter talks about what might passion, what might desire look like if we could tell these multiple stories, multifarious spaces from which we emerge and move and have our being and our identity. Michael talks about, you know, and references Hilary Beckles and so on, centering women. How do we get that space back? What might that look like? You, from your own reading, Shona, and Donna, talking about these two writers who, you know, are emboldened, if you like, by a reclamation of that space of the erotic. And so, you know, I wonder if each of you might speak to the idea of, you know, at the level of theory. All right, we have Susan Sontag, we have Audre Lorde sort of proffering a mode, a hermeneutics, if you like, or they would shun that word. They would shun that word, all right? In favor of thinking of a mode, a way of understanding the erotic and the importance of it, and how we read it, how we understand it, taking it out of the normative sort of modes and structures, how we read text normally. They're offering something that is less Euro-rationally oriented and more toward heightened sensibilities and sensitivities in terms of how we might read texts of you know, various sorts. What do you think is the value, or in what way might we think of theorizing erotic literature?
Well, let me start with Lorde, because she says that when we live outside ourselves, and by that I mean on external directives only, rather than from our internal knowledge and needs, when we live away from those erotic guides from within ourselves, then our lives are limited by external and alien forms, and we conform to the needs of a structure that is not based on human need, let alone an individual's. But when we begin to live from within outward, in touch with the power of the erotic within ourselves, and allowing that power to inform all and illuminate our actions upon the world around us, then we begin to be responsible to ourselves in the deepest sense. For as we begin to recognize our deepest feelings, we begin to give up of necessity, being satisfied with suffering and self-negation, and with the numbness which so often seems like their only alternative in our society. So clearly there is a connection there for Lorde, and for so many women writers who see Lorde as a literary ancestor, like Shauna Morgan, that we really live our deepest and richest lives when we are fully in touch with the erotic, and that the erotic is not about sex without sex just for the sake of sensation, as Shauna already suggested, but that it is really a way of getting in touch with who we really are at the deepest level. And I think that is why she makes it a point of her duty to connect healing in the cancer journals with pleasure, with our own erotic pleasure, with our own self-pleasuring, as I was pointing out, so that we can understand that this is not just about sex for the sake of sex, that the erotic is more than sex, that the erotic is a spiritual connection. And I wasn't being facetious when I mentioned Marvin Gaye's song, because I think we tend to hear that song and we think of it on a very surface level. But when you pair that with when you pair Marvin Gaye's sexual healing with Lorde, you can understand Marvin Gaye's song on a much deeper level as well, that he was actually, there was a subtext to what Marvin might have been singing about that we never really thought to make that connection. And I think for me, Lorde makes that connection, and it becomes glaringly obvious when you look at other people's works where sex is really just about sensation, or sex is about objectification. Sex is not about connection. Whereas for Lorde, it is clearly about connection, connecting with another human being, connecting across struggles, connecting across our common humanity, connecting even across our differences, right? And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely a theory there about the importance of the erotic, that we cannot afford to not engage it, but it's how we understand the erotic that is really important. That it's not on the surface level as pornography is, which is what a lot of people think about when they think about the erotic.
Yeah. Yeah, that importance of differentiating between pornography and the erotic. A lot of people conflate the two. And, as you so very well point out, Donna, there are differentiations to be made with respect to these two concepts. Does anybody else want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll take it to the other theorists you mentioned, then Sontag on the other side. I mean, that line is instead, what is it? Instead of hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art, she says. And I mean, it comes back in one way. This is going to be quite an old-fashioned answer, but if the erotics of art is about enjoying the sensuousness of art, some of that approach is going to have to be kind of getting away from that need to analyze and kind of kill something to death and look for the meaning and the moral as the most important thing.
Yeah.
And, Michael is teaching this poetry class. I'm teaching poetry this semester. And one of the things that's hardest to do is to tell students that they actually love poetry and that they've loved poetry since they were this small. And, they're in love with the rhythms and they're in love with the rhyme and the sound effects because they think that they have to look for the meaning, right? And the moral. And they've lost entirely that idea that you can just sit with the poem or sit with the text or sit with the art and figure out, what is this thing to me? What does it mean to me? In some kind of deeply meaningful way that is not superficial. And that's a perfectly valid answer. And I think part of what an erotics of art has to do is to teach people how to fall back in love with the text. How do you fall back in love with the sensuousness of the art object, right? And see that not as a superficial thing, but as a kind of deeply radical thing. Because I think people think, I remember, when I was an undergraduate, Bell Hooks came to talk, and she was talking about how love was her thing. I think she'd just done the love book, and she was talking about this. And, one of the students stood up and said, "You want us to love? There's all this injustice in the world." And she stood up and she, that voice that she has. And she was like, "I'm not talking about no namby-pamby hallmark love. I'm talking radical love." And I mean, I think that's a similar thing, right? How can you teach that the love of the poem, the enjoyment of the poem can be a radical, deep engagement, right? I think that would bring us into the discourse of the erotic, because the aesthetic is about the body, feeling. So that's the way that you suture those two together, I think.
And Peter, that makes me think of even, the idea of, loving a book, right? There are some of us freaks who like, oh, I love to smell the book, and and the erotics of that as well, in terms of connecting with the literature in a particular kind of way, even before we get into the reading process, and just that tactile, that again, the touch and the smell and the connecting with the literature in that kind of way, in some ways sort of gets us to that point as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to just add that in Shirley's work, that's one of the things that we've been looking at, how she twins the pleasure of sex with the pleasure of creative endeavor, writing, and even the pleasure of food, right? The mention of the mango and the last poem, but how those three things come together as heightened, a kind of heightened pleasure in reading her work. It seems to me that any kind of theorizing, and of course we've all been informed by Lord's work to a large extent, and how she shifts the paradigm in the way in which she looks at it. And I think that part of the process of thinking through the erotic as whether we want to call it hermeneutics or some kind of strategy of understanding is that it privileges feeling and the affective
Exactly.
domain.
Exactly.
And primarily because that is often feminized or associated with women, it's one of those things that people kind of dismiss. And so we have an order Lord who recovers that aspect. It seems to place value on pleasure.
Yes.
And the fact of enjoyment. One of the kinds of things that I've been working on is the idea of dress and how Black people get a sense of great pleasure out of how they look. And it's a kind of erotics of how you look and the pleasure in that. You see that in dancehall culture. And when you have nothing else as a kind of source of capitalist valuation to the economics of that paradigm, then there's a pleasure paradigm that people are getting validation from. And so I think we have to think about the value placed on pleasure. And thirdly, as said by other speakers, the idea of connection, the sense of intimacy. If there's one thing that COVID has taught us with all of this isolation, is how much as human beings that we value connection.
Yes.
And I think that paradigm is going to shift some of the kinds of categories of value that we to which we think.
Yes.
One of the things that is evident to me, and based on everybody's comments as well, is that the poetry itself is theorizing, right? The
Yes.
poetry itself is doing the theorizing, and I think about somebody like Kai Miller, for example, and you know, in his work, I see this thing that I've been sort of trying to tease out, this erotic divine, or this kind of sensual divine thing, this spiritual erotic thing that's happening in his work that, you know, again, sort of forces some kind of theorizing, but it gets to that point of connection and intimacy, and intimacy sort of across, you know, sort of all kinds of intimacy, right? With self, with even dirt, even, you know, somebody in a pew next to you in a church, or, you know, even through language. And so it's interesting. It just has me thinking that the art itself is sort of doing the theorizing.
Thank you so much for that. And in keeping with that last comment, one of our persons has asked the question, is poetry the best literary genre to convey eroticism, the erotic?
I'm a little biased towards poetry myself. But I think Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Lord and other. Lord does it in Zami. Toni Morrison certainly does it in almost every book. So it really depends on the writer. I think it's really, a lot of writers are very lyrical already, whether they consider themselves to be strictly writing poetry or not. So I wouldn't be essentialist about it, even though I do have a bias towards poetry, personally.
And thank you. And it occurred to me, you know, we're talking about pleasure and, you know, basking in pleasure and enjoying pleasure and in pursuit of pleasure. And I'm thinking, you know, Orthodox Christian principles and values, and, you know, you're to shun pleasure. And I'm wondering the role that has played in terms of our conditioning with respect to how we view indulgence in pleasure or representations of pleasure, passion in literary works. You know, Peter, you talk about the dearth of that kind of writing, and, you know, in Bahamian, you specified Bahamian literature in particular, but even more broadly across the region. You know, I mean, there is the 62 writers published in Caribbean erotic, you know, but I'm still wondering whether there is this censorship of the imagination that people perhaps still feel, that there's that reticence, or there's, you know, a reluctance to kind of engage, whether in writing or in other forms of representation. You mentioned dancehall, and perhaps there's no reticence there, Michael, you know, but, you know, I wonder generally and broadly whether there is still that sort of reserve, hesitation, or will it topple what we have internalized as, you know, maybe a kind of a belief system that sort of insulates us, or we attempt to use to insulate us from what we might consider unwholesome and pornographic and undesirable as a discourse to fully engage and immerse ourselves in. I don't know.
I just wanted to add to the when you mentioned Judeo-Christian influences, and I wondered, I'm also teaching a course called Reggae Poetry. And so we're looking at reggae lyrics in this course. And one of the things that comes across is that idea of that restraint and respectability. We're looking at a Lady Saw song the other day, Under the Sycamore Tree, in which Lady Saw, as much as she's the icon of this female sexual liberated woman, reclaims in that song, appeals to the idea of respectability, that she can do a marathon sex thing and she can be on top. The idea of riding this particular bike. But then she appeals to this church image to say she's a good girl, and to ask me to do fellatio is therefore too far. And part of what some of that discussion generated is the idea that there's a kind of middle class co-option of religion in support of a kind of respectability culture. And oftentimes, if you look at other classes, I like to say to people, I have never seen a more frank representation of the lower class than somebody like Austin Clarke in Sisters and Sons, or that earlier novel. It's slipping my memory now. But what Clarke does is to represent a kind of frankness about sexuality, that you don't have these pretensions around. And I think that part of that question is not just Christian, but a kind of respectability culture that says we ought not to, it's a kind of 19th century idea that we ought not to disclose what we do quietly, but it's everybody's doing it, and it's about this, a second thing, not just respectability, but about this differentiation between what you publicly declare and what you're privately engaged in.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of the question as well.
Yes.
Thank you. And so we have some questions coming up in the chat. One from Zanzi Bethel, which I'll read. How do we navigate that murky space between the healing and redemptive power of the erotic and the near ubiquitous historical trauma of sex/desire? How to rationalize hedonism in a traumatized space?
I guess for me, you reclaim it for yourself. You reclaim it and you rename it. Because when you allow yourself to be defined from the outside, you're disempowered by somebody else. Somebody else decides who you are and what you ought to do and how they see you. When you reclaim that for yourself, then that's how you navigate that space between the healing and redemptive power and the trauma, because the trauma really comes from the outside. The trauma is something visited upon you, even if you eventually internalize it and it affects you in a particular way, it's still something imposed from the outside. Usually, trauma is usually not something we impose upon ourselves. So when you reject it, and when you claim the erotic, when you understand the erotic as something that belongs to you and something that is empowering and something that you can use to heal yourself and to kind of move, transcend, your circumstances, I think just a reclaiming of it is powerful enough to allow that kind of transcendence, to allow you to find a way to navigate it where that space, so that you take back your power. Right? Rather than allowing them to constantly impose their own ideology or their own their traumas on you, which is, they're very good at doing that. The society is very good at doing that. And to kind of link that to Christianity, the Christian, if you read the Bible itself, Old and New Testament, you'll see that it's sometimes some of the doctrine in the Bible is very different from what they actually teach you in the church. It's like it's the way that it's interpreted. It's that dichotomy. It's that split that they create between the sexuality and spirituality that is an artificial binary, right? Like when you even when you read some, I don't know if you've read, like Sue Houchin did a collection on the spiritual narratives. And I think it was published by Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And even the spiritual narratives, you can see the woman, the Black woman, and these are women who are enslaved, trying to reclaim the erotic through Christianity, and they're doing it through the Holy Ghost. They're talking about being, entered, the Holy Ghost enters them, right? And then they begin to express what that feels. And the language is very sexual. And so you can see them trying to find a way to incorporate the erotic into the doctrine, even though the doctrine is telling them that this is not okay. And it's like, this is the only way to talk about the body, the only way to talk about the pleasure of the body is to kind of tie it to spirituality, to tie it to, to Christian doctrine in a very binarized way. So they don't know how to do that. So what they do is kind of transfer the sexual aspects of it onto something else, onto something spiritual, rather than melding the two, right? And I find it, in terms of the language that they're using, they're kind of doing a kind of transference, where it's like, I can only experience sex through the Holy Ghost, right? I can be filled with the Holy Ghost, and that's okay. That's a way to express my sexuality, my erotic power through the whole. And I found it fascinating when I discovered that that was what they were doing, because it's like, it's forbidden in the church, but it's not necessarily separated in the same way in the Bible. It's just separated by the doctrine that they preach.
Mhm.
All right, we have a question here from Keisha Ellis. She says, I also reread Love in the Time of Color during the lockdown. Garcia Marquez's skills as a writer is obvious, and his descriptions of how love made him feel physically are superb, but his writing about sex is just that, well-crafted descriptions of sex. Hearing his words next to those of Audre Lorde, Sappho, and the other women writers lead me to ask a blunt question: can men write erotica? And if so, have they?
Can I read something Craig wrote?
No, no, you cannot.
Can I answer
No,
it
no,
that
go
way?
ahead.
We have another question.
Come on, Craig. I can read some. What page is it on? 60. Okay, let me answer you with a poem.
Oh my gosh.
Mind blowing. Love is in the mind, but when you give it me head, I cannot think straight.
Oh.
Anyway, so this question is for Dr.
Saltwater kisses. They're very short. Come on, Craig. Winds kiss wet faces, dark bodies embraced in waves, toes curl under sand, trying not to splash, coal-colored faces smiling. Eating sapodillas. We don't call it sapodilla in Jamaica, so tell me if I'm saying it right. Neesberry, exactly. Eating sapodillas. The moment is now. Lips press against downy skin, moisten with the tongue. Now bite into it. Teeth penetrate juicy flesh. Taste nature's nectar.
I don't think
I like that. I wanted an opportunity to share your poetry. She just gave it to me. So this is in the book Opal and I put together, Caribbean Erotic, and that's one of 3 of Craig's. Very short. I think we had done some haikus, right, Craig?
We did, yes.
And you wrote those from those haikus, and I've always liked those. So yeah, I think so. I think men can write the erotic. It depends on your mindset.
As aptly demonstrated. Wonderful. So we have another question from Curtia Roll to Dr. Bailey. What would the erotic look like with the many representations we can have in Bahamian society? And is there space enough for every representation? Do you see this as a necessity in terms of developing a national literature?
I'm not sure what it would look like. I mean, I think we would have to discover together. Whether there's space, yeah. I mean, I feel like as long as there's somebody to write a text and someone to read it, you can put that representation out there. I mean, some may be resisted by people that don't want to see particular forms, but that doesn't mean that you can't put them there. I mean, that happens all the time. And do I think it's a necessity? Yeah, I tell you. So I feel like there are as many types of experience in the world, and you never know what you may identify with, what may cause you at any minute to feel like I can survive this particular day, right? When if you read this or you encounter this in this text. So I think some of those things are definitely necessary. Again, thinking about just practical experience, you sit around and you any number of students may come through your office at any time and tell you about something that's going on with them, and you think to yourself, if you could read this or if you could see this, you would see that you're not by yourself. Other people have felt like this, or other people have experienced these things. So I think that those representations are vital, and they would just make us richer.
Peter, that I think that's an opportunity for me to read this piece by Essex Hemphill, which I think speaks to what you're just saying. Now we think as we fuck. This nut might kill us. There might be a pin-sized hole in the condom, a lethal leak. We stop kissing. Tall, dark strangers sucking mustaches, putting lips, tongues everywhere. We return to pictures, telephones, toys, recent lovers, private lives. Now we think as we fuck. This nut might kill us. This kiss could turn to stone. And so I think, to piggyback on what Peter's saying in terms of how we use the literature and how we use the erotic even to deal and work through things that someone, and of course this poem is speaking about the AIDS epidemic and the dangers of the erotic in certain ways, right? But still the necessity to connect, to touch, to love, to express in that way is vital and necessary.
Okay, there's another question, CJ Bogle, and it's addressed, I guess, to all members of the panel. There seems to be quite a binary opposition set up between the pornographic and the erotic in the panel. I wonder how we might think about how Black feminist scholars have tried to read pornography beyond the obvious issues of exploitation and preparing, as offering Black women possibilities of economic agency. And as Jennifer Nash would argue, that racial, quote, fictions can create a space of agency and pleasure for Black female subjects, end quote. What does the panel think about this alternative formulation and labor issues?
I would say I would want to hear it from the women in the industry. Because I remember we had a conference once, long time ago at Hunter. Was it at Hunter? But it was in New York. When I was at Hunter, it was in New York. And I remember we had invited some women from the were sex workers. And the way that some of us, right, as feminists, were trying to re-theorize and recontextualize sex work was very different from the way that the women wanted us to talk about it, because they didn't necessarily feel that way. A lot of them felt like they had that this was something they did because they had to do it, but not something they would have chosen to do necessarily. So I guess that would be my response. I'm very wary because of that experience. I'm very wary, and I always wonder what do the women and men who do sex work, how do they feel? Yes, you can have your agency doing sex work and you can make a decision, but it's to do that, but it feels to me from when I've had the opportunity to have those conversations that it seems to me to be a choice made out of no choice, a choice made out of not having choice, and also something that a lot of people come to after being extremely traumatized sexually. Not everybody, but that's my answer, and it might not be the politically correct one, but that's my answer. I see a difference between in how we think about because pornography tends to make sex be about just sensation, right, without connection. and because it tends to make it about objectification, because there is a tendency in the industry to do that. I would want to hear from the workers themselves rather than someone who is not a sex worker theorizing about it. I want to know what the people who are living it think about that.
I think that's always my question is, if there is agency in sex work and a degree of agency, ultimately, is it pandering? Who is it serving ultimately? Is it serving the capitalist structure, white supremacist patriarchal capitalist structure? I'm thinking about conversations I've had here in the US about that. And even if you think about film industry, for example, right? There is a sort of growing market of women filmmakers who are attempting to make erotica, right? That appeal to a different kind of audience, right? Than the pornography that we're so typical of, that's so typical of the mainstream. But ultimately, again, the question is, is it in service of that horror structure that Audre Lorde refers to?
Yeah.
I think that's the question that I always ask, and I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah.
But I do know that the making of art, right? Just to sort of call back to that question that Zanzi had about how do you navigate that space, right? Between trauma, between power and oppression, right? That you'll see in pornography, and a healing space. And I think the making of art, right? Whether it's visual art or poetry, and even just the process of making it becomes a sort of defiant thing. And so I don't know if I can think about sex work in that way. Although, there are women who, I know who have gone from doing sex work in service of, right, that structure to focusing on sex work that's targeted at women's healing, right? So I think there are some innovative things that are happening there, but again, I don't know if we can just talk about the agency without asking that question.
Okay, we have another question from viewer Natario Thompson. This is to Dr. Soleil. The work attitude that you referenced with the 51 years of affairs is an identity mode of existence that is easily recognizable in DL or closeted men within Bahamian society, and maybe even the wider Caribbean. When you mentioned that, I've always looked at it from the woman or the lover who has had their heart broken or received unrequited love. But I am wondering if it is an attempt to be freed from the patriarchal confines of hegemonic or toxic masculinity.
In the case of Florentino, in Love in the Time of Cholera, it is not. I think the way that Marquez draws this character, the way that Marquez portrays this character, he's very critical of hegemonic patriarchy, but he's critical of it in the patriarch who's recognized as such in the society, like Fermina Diaz's husband, right? And who's a doctor and, from a great family, from a well-recognized family in the community and so on. And Florentino Ariza, who is the one who fell in love with her first, as they were both young, right? He was early 20s, she was a teenager, and it ended up losing out to the doctor, right? But the way he goes about dealing with women, it's also very hegemonic. It's very different from the doctor, who probably has one or maybe two affairs, but he's married to one woman. And the way that this main character who's in love, the way he with Fermina, the way he deals with women, it's very much the way that you would you'd compare that more to what goes on in contemporary society with men who are just very, you know, whorish, right? For want of a better word, very promiscuous, and without any kind of sense of how their behavior affects the woman, right? He's not really careful about the woman's feelings in any of this. And although he gets a lot from them, he doesn't see them as invaluable beings, but he's using them for his own satisfaction, and he doesn't really give much back in return because he's really saving himself for someone else. So where I think that could be appropriate elsewhere in this particular text, I would say that Garcia Marquez is as critical of this kind of expression of patriarchy as he is of the other more traditional expression of patriarchy. And it's not that Florentino he's not a gay male. He uses that as a cover for his activities so that nobody will know that he's going around philandering with all these women, because ultimately he wants Fermina's husband to die so he can get into a relationship with her. And as a matter of fact, what he tells her when he does get her back is that he's kept himself a virgin for her. Which is a flipping of the script, if ever there was one, because she's been married and sexually active with her husband with children. And he's saying, I've been a virgin all this time, 51 years, because he wants, to kind of keep this ideal of himself that she had when she was a teenager. He wanted to keep that intact. So he deliberately, I guess, supported or encouraged that view of himself as being a homosexual. If he were, that would have been a different story. If he were just trying to mask his homosexuality, that would have been a different story, but that was not the case in this particular narrative.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, and then we will wrap up after the second question. Marie, do you have a question?
Well, I'm just reading Deborah Gordon's question, and it's addressed to all panelists. How do you think love and lust will be written about with the effects of social distancing, lockdowns during the pandemic? Some sociologists have shared that many have become touch-starved. Will it become mundane, exaggerated, or something entirely new? What are your thoughts?
I think we're going to see entirely new forms of erotics. People adapt, Foucault was saying that, he was waiting for somebody to invent a new sexual pleasure in the 70s. I think that people, anyway, and what he did about that is another story. But I think you see new things, right? So people are having their erotic things over Zoom. They are, sneaking off after curfew, which has its own thrill, right? They're doing all kinds of things. There's a whole catalog of things that what people are doing. I think people's sex lives have entirely shifted so that ghost run that people do between 3 and 5 in the morning, they now do at 5 to 7 in the morning before work. Like, it's stuff like that. So I think you're going to see a whole new set of activities, discourses, and feelings. And after the curfew it's over, I think people will be nostalgic for some of the things that were happening under these conditions. Although you don't think that now, but yeah, I think you'll find that.
Craig, there's a question there.
Yeah. So we have, someone just said, all right. So what are the practical steps for folks to begin this reclamation of the erotic from imperialist, capitalist, and the colonial trauma and influences? And as you think about that, let me just read this. I think there was another one that says she was skipped over.
It's the same. It's the same person. Yeah.
Okay.
I think.
What are the go ahead, Shauna.
I think I'll sort of try to address the previous question and maybe try to pick up the thread of the last question you read. This idea of sort of thinking about these new ways of being, right? I think one of the things that might come out of the pandemic, at least I hope, is that we'll sort of start revisiting the constraints, right, of intimacy that exist, right? Whether they be our understanding of gender or even just the understanding of erotic, right? And intimacy. What does it mean to touch, to hold hands with someone who maybe you don't have sex with, right? What does it mean to have an intimate and deep conversation with someone face to face? I think that, again, my hope is that what will emerge is a different understanding, in addition to sort of those innovative things that Dr. Bailey talked about, maybe a departure from, the very sort of, uh, puritanical ideas and constraints around sexuality, around intimacy, around love, even, right? What does it mean to hold a friend's hand or to touch, to share space? I just hope that there will be a different kind of openness to thinking about a kind of continuum of erotic, right? And what that means, what it means to be with people.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that some people have kind of dug in. Some people some people have said like to hell with it. People are traveling for love, and and it's like everybody is not following the rules. Some people have decided, hey, I could die tomorrow or the next, you know what I mean? Some people have taken this very aggressive attitude towards love. Let me pursue what makes me feel good, in this, because, who knows? Just take the proper precautions, but let me pursue not everybody is constrained, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I suppose I would add that some people will enjoy autoeroticism in the context of being separated, and that might increase. But I also think that perhaps one aspect of eroticism, which is about longing and to have desire and waiting for it to be fulfilled, might be increased at this particular point in time. And in fact, the language, which sometimes we don't talk about, that part of eroticism is pre-touch and so on, is about the sweet somethings that people will say, and the kind of language of enticement and engagement. And I agree with Peter that this can be done across electronic devices where people are engaging prior to that moment of the poetry. Poetry perhaps is getting a bigger purchase these days in the moment of separation.
I agree with that too. What was the last question? I don't remember the last question. How was it framed? What was the question?
How do you think that love and lust will be written about with the effects of social distancing and the lockdowns? Yeah, that was
a penultimate one. What was the last one?
The practical steps for folks to begin the reclamation of erotic from
imperialist, capitalist, and colonial trauma.
Yeah, I guess it's going to be different for everybody. For me, it's always reading and writing. I mean, I was determined to read Love in the Time of Color, and this panel forced me to read it. That was my project from the beginning of the lockdown. I was like, okay, I'm gonna read this book, right? I'm gonna read this book during this season. It's taken me long enough, but I finally did it. So for me, it's always through fiction and poetry. It's my way. So I think it's going to be different for everybody. There isn't a one rule for everyone. That's the beauty of it.
Let me throw out this. This will probably be the final question, and then after you answer this question, we'll give the panelists another 2 minutes to for final thoughts. But this question is a question we skipped over. For Donna, this is for you. In Love in a Time of Cholera, this is from Sonora Edwards.
Sonora.
Yeah. In Love in the Time of Cholera, there is so much unexpected humor in the text, and Lord centers pleasure, joy, and satisfaction in uses of the erotic. This makes me think about the connection between the erotic and laughter, the satisfaction and connection we can find in sharing a laugh with one another. We often even say that humor is sexy, and find those who can create laughter attractive in dating and finding mates. It seems like the erotic laughter can be a source of healing. Can you speak to the humor in Marquez's work and how it functions in the text as a force of erotic attraction and healing? How has laughter served as healing in your own life and work?
Marquez's work is so funny, Sanira, that I find myself like, I think I was reading it at 3 o'clock in the morning, laughing out loud in the house at 3 o'clock. And I'm not the only one in the house. And just it's the way it functions in the text is to kind of, it humanizes the characters, and it actually allows you to like a character that, I mean, I liked him all the way until the very end when the little girl killed herself. And then I was just like, you know what? I'm through with him right now, right? You know, like he seduced this little girl and then didn't realize that she actually fell in love with him, right? And then moreover, he's a pedophile. What do you call that? He's a pedophile.
Yeah.
Pedophile. Right. So yeah, that I was disgusted with that because of the little girl, you know, the age, but also, you know, but up until that point, the humor, there's so much humor in Marquez's work that it's like it disarms you, and it pulls you in, and it makes you really like this character who, you know, it's like when you look at him with a clear-eyed view, is not that lovable character, but as you're reading it, he's a very lovable character. You're going along with him. You want to find out what's going to happen. You're rooting for him. You know, I think part of that has to do with the humor in the text. In my own work, I think I would like to just read just a little bit of one of my poems in Caribbean erotic as a response. Laughter. A deep belly laugh is better than medicine, but nothing better than a hard night's loving. Parting my lips, I flash you a hint of pink tongue. Watch your bad boy turn loose, skinning pupilix and cutting up desire, giddy up into your sweet brown skin, laughter bubbling over. A deep belly laugh is better than medicine, but nothing better than a hard night's loving. You grab my ankles, I tumble ungraciously, balanced on the tip of your mirth, riding the delicious peals of your baritone, my belly filling up with glee. Soon I will burst, give birth to bang belly verses full of themselves. A deep belly laugh is better than medicine, but not no better than a hard night's loving. We laugh till we hiccup like drunks, bouncing off walls and staggering about, clutching at each other to break or fall. Tears run down like rivers. Tears run like river down our cheeks. I drink your salt in till I brim over, swallow your laughter to hoard for my rainy days, but a rhythm change.
Nice.
All right. Time for a cigarette. All right. So I guess
Hold the cigarette. I read one, but wait until after this one. You might want to have the cigarette.
All right. Or a drink as well.
I close with a poem by Shirley again. From across the room. You trot into rooms, big horse, high haunch, sure foot. A sudden craving for whatever you're offering. Coconut drops, tamarind balls in my mouth. Half grain hot eucalyptus oil down my back. Lips, dark, fermented, risen, sure to hold a whole breast nipple to clavicle in the swamp of your mouth. You can pluck the stem from a cherry, no hands. Drip juice, I can be the cup. Those hands that turn me into the Bible, rip me out like Psalms stuffed into black back pockets. Hallelujah, God didn't do wrong. Wide chest a girl can write stories on. I'll have your baby in the back seat of a taxi. Skin like coffee served with a teaspoon of condensed milk. Cinnamon and nutmeg on top. How you like your coffee? I hope you like it black like the folds of me. Wrap me up like a rediscovered love letter. Edges flayed, dank, words still intact. Press hard, press up. Throw me like a fist, like a vase, like a scream. Or lay me down soft like a song, like new white linen, like dew on the mountain. Let me guide you to a tree, a hammock, a whistling skirt, a private spot. Have your cigarette now.
Lovely, lovely.
Well, let me wait to
I
hear
don't
from.
even smoke and I will have one.
All right, let's hear from Shauna and Peter. Any parting words for us?
No, sir. Me can't. I'll read Tanya poem.
Oh my gosh.
No, I don't think so.
No.
I'm good.
All right. Marie, any
Parting shots? Sure. Just to say, thank you so very much to all the panelists for this fantastic session. It was rich. It was, it engendered a great deal of thought and discourse back and forth. I was happy to see, you know, some of the students very busy with their questions and other participants busy with questions. I hope we got to all of them. And I thought it was a very great panel, a splendid opportunity to discuss and converse about these on this topic that, you know, a lot of people, I think, might still, even among some of my students I see here, have a great deal of reticence. So, you know, bringing it out in the open, you know, not censoring the imagination, if you like, you know, and making it a discourse worthy of exploration and so on. You know, it has enriched, I think, you know, the way in which we think of erotics, etc. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marie and Craig, and all the panelists, Michael and Peter and Shauna. This was fun.
Yes,
Before we go, I'd just like to I want to leave us with actually the introduction from Black Erotica, Erotic Noir. And the introduction is written by Ntozake Shange. Says, "We are lost in the confusion of myths and fears of race and sex. To be good people, to be respectable and worthy citizens, we've had to combat absurd phantasmagoric stereotypes about our sexuality, our lust and loves, to the extent that we disavow our own sensuality to each other. So, how do we speak of our desires for each other to each other in a language where our relationships to our bodies and desires lacked dignity as well as nuance? Mm-hmm. Sex and sensuality are elements of any progressive discussion. Here in these stories and poems, we are not myths or stereotypes, art forms or sex objects. We are simply folks at intimate play, our fierce rhythms of desire, the erotic, unencumbered by the other, close and hot." So I think that that's a great place for us to leave, again, in terms of thinking about our connections with the erotic and our reconnection with our bodies and ourselves outside of the gaze of the other. And again, I want to thank all the panelists, everyone who logged in, who registered to be a part of the conversation, everyone who put questions forward. Based on this conversation, it seems that there are more conversations that need to be had. And hopefully we'll be able to organize that. Maybe even a conference, who knows? So we can look forward to that. But again, thank you to everyone. And I want to encourage everyone to keep an eye out. As I said, the Blue Flamingo Literary Festival is coming up in a couple of weeks, March 18th and 19th. And so keep an eye out for those flyers. If you have any questions or concerns, you can always contact me. All righty, thank you all for tuning in, and
again, thank you very much.
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you.
Good to see you, Donna.
Good to see all of you now.
So many times. And Shauna, it's a pleasure to meet you and to hear
good to meet you. Good to meet everyone.
Yes, Shauna and Peter.
Likewise.
Pleasure to meet you both.
Donna, you haven't been to UB yet, Donna. We need to change that.
Yes, please.
Yeah, man.
Ready anytime.
Sure.
A couple workshops.
Ready like Freddie all the time.
Shout out to all my students who joined.
Yes. And so I was pointing out, we're officially done, but I was pointing out, and
thanks to my students who joined too. Thank you all.
I don't know if I should mention it, that all the panelists are Jamaican. And so
Peter is Jamaican too?
Yes,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Oh,
Really?
I have been.
So Craig, why did you do that?
It wasn't by, it just happened to be that way. So I don't know. Maybe
Really?
Jamaica's more erotic than everybody else. I
I'm
don't
I'm
know.
gonna let you explain that because I'm not touching that one.
Anyway, but thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
And Donna, you didn't mention that it's coming up on the 10th anniversary of Caribbean Erotic, right?
Yes,
And
it is
you're
coming
planning-
up on the 10th anniversary. So I will be sending to folks and ask you to send to your folks. Opal and I are going to be doing an anniversary celebration sometime this term before the semester is over. I don't think it's March, maybe April is Poetry Month, so maybe in April. And I will definitely, so look out for it, for the flyer and the information. I'll send to Craig and Marie and ask them to send to Shauna, and I'll send to Michael and ask them to send to Peter, and so on and so forth. And everybody here, hopefully it will get around. I'm not on social media, so it's harder for me to get stuff around, but with a little help from my friends, the word will get out.
We get it
Yes.
done.
Mhm.
All right, folks. Have a good evening.
Take
All
care.
right.
Okay.
Bye,
Take it
everyone.
easy, everybody. God
Ciao.
bless. Stay safe.
All right.